an introduction to any of you, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He is going to talk to us today about a really amazing story of the rushed energy transition in Lebanon, which has been going on for the last 4 or 5 years, really since 2021. And he will give you the backdrop for that and tell you all about it. It's not just a story of solarization around the country, but he tells it as a technopolitical story that is about solar panels and inverters, but also about a lot of really interesting characters. And this is where Camillo comes in. He spent more than a year in Beirut and in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, with funding both from the Atkinson Center for Sustainability and from the National Science Foundation. He is a wonderful storyteller, but also a really great ethnographer. And I guess those two things go together. But to be, he has this way, as all of you know, of interacting with people that I think allowed him to see things and hear things and observe things that most people probably would not get access to. The other thing that I think will come through in the presentation is that Camillo is a really good writer. He was very worried about the writing part of the dissertation, and it turned out that it was incredibly smooth and rapid and relatively, quote unquote, easy for him. And there's a lot of good humor in the writing. The writing is very ethnographic and beautiful in that way. And we have strongly encouraged him. The dissertation is really in book form, and we hope that there will be a book that materializes relatively soon. What else did I want to say? All of you know he joined the Ph.D. program in 2019. And before that, he did a wide range of things. What was most interesting to me was the lumberjack part. But he was also a consultant, a development consultant. He worked for the Austrian Development Agency, and he's worked on a wide range of projects on water and sanitation and energy all over the world, places like Sierra Leone, Austria, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories. So he came to us with a remarkable amount of experience and a master's degree in hand. And I am really glad, a testament to someone who's been gone for so long, that so many people showed up, including landlords and Arabic teachers and colleagues and faculty. And so Camillo has been a delight to work with, and I am going to turn it over to him to tell us about his dissertation.
Thank you, Laurie. Hello, and also thank you, first of all, for those of you who are here and the people in the digital realm. I hope this works. I'm a little bit nervous, and also the big introduction will certainly now sort of lead to a disappointing kind of experience for you guys. So Laurie was, this is going very fast, very kind. I think she already told this story for me. Those of you who don't know me, I'm from Austria. I did my bachelor's and master's in Vienna and Paris. We had Sierra Leone. I worked as a consultant for a couple of years. Then a sabbatical in Lebanon got me interested in the energy topics there. And I applied for PhD programs in the US. I was very happy to be able to come here, spend 5 wonderful years on the shores of Cayuga, which some of you know extremely well and others know well, and also a very nice year of field research in Lebanon. And you haven't seen me in the last 6 months because I was in Denmark as a visiting scholar at the Danish Technical University. All right, and in a way it starts with darkness, you could say. The title of my dissertation is Under the Patronage of the Sun, the Technopolitics of Lebanon's Rushed Energy Transition. And the view you see here is from the town or city of Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley, facing north-northwest. You can see the Lebanese mountain range already snow-covered to some extent. It's late November. Yeah, and some of you might have already spotted sort of the objects of my interest that brought me there at the time. Oh, this is another, sorry, a map first. Just to situate you here, we're on the Eastern Mediterranean. You are, I would say, unfortunately, more familiar with this particular geography at the moment than you should be. Baalbek has been heavily bombed in the last year or so, and you've probably heard the name of the Bekaa Valley and of these towns because of the war in Gaza and Lebanon in the last years. I did a year of dissertation field research in that area. I was curious about the changing energy landscapes. As already hinted, I was interested in the many solar panels highlighted here for you again. Virtually every house, every building has one. If there's multiple occupants, there'll be several such systems installed. That in itself is already quite fascinating. What is even more astonishing, and hence the title Rushed, is that you would not have seen a single panel there just a year and a half before. So in early 2021, there would not have been a solar panel on any of these roofs. And in November of 2022, basically everyone has one. To underscore that with some data, here you see a graph from the Lebanese customs, the main port, where you see tonnage of solar panels that are being unloaded at the port. And this is sort of the last decade, more or less, and you see nothing happens. And then in 2021, a sort of 1,000-fold increase. Everybody's buying that stuff. And below, a quote from a World Bank survey that in this area, some 70% of households now have solar systems. So in a way, the question, and also that's sort of what I then preoccupied myself with, is like, well, what happened? How does this happen? You know, we all talk about energy transition and renewables and lots of money spent on it. So what was going on? What happened is a near total blackout. Here, this is a press image. I think it's actually a Photoshop, but it does sort of a good job at visual representation. Électricité du Liban. That's the state utility in charge of providing electricity throughout Lebanon, is sort of blacked out, and the city behind it is black. So there's no electricity. Here, some newspaper clippings from the time. The BBC writes, Lebanon has plunged into darkness, total power outage, electricity disaster, etc. This is all in summer and fall of 2022. The reason for these power outages was a disruption of the fuel supply chain. So where there were fuel shortages that themselves were the outcome of a financial and political crisis. So there's no fuel coming to the country. In addition, in 2020, there was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions that sort of the world had ever seen, happening in the port of Beirut, completely destroying EDL's headquarters, in addition to the already severe financial and economic crisis. I think I have an image from the control room. This is what it still looks like now, sort of the headquarters of the electricity utility, completely blown up. In this context, solar PV became the only means of securing access to electricity. And that's why everyone wanted to have it. Before we go into the solar systems and sort of solar energy stories themselves, I'll take another step back. And we're following sort of the trajectory of my actual book or dissertation right now. Okay, so there's a brief historical background. Before this breakdown, there was what I term sort of a dual energy regime in place since the end of the Lebanese Civil War, which itself lasted from 1975 until 1990. And so everyday users and businesses, etc., would rely on two sources of electricity, not just one. There would be the state utility, EDL, which was weak in a sense, and had frequent blackouts, so electricity would come on in the morning and would randomly shut off sometime in the afternoon. And to fill those gaps, people would also rely on neighborhood backup generators. So not just on your own balcony, but a relatively large industrial size generator that would sell electricity through a parallel network of cables to people for a subscription, so that you wouldn't have to live in darkness when the state was off. The first sort of part of this, Électricité du Liban, was established in 1962 as part of Lebanon's sort of nation-building project under President Shekab. This was sort of at the time of independence and of rural electrification, etc. This is the same building, so it's actually beautiful architecture that you saw so destroyed in one of the previous pictures. However, and this was also a period where Lebanon could export electricity to neighboring Syria. There was a lot of hydro and there were new power plants being built. However, during those 15 years of civil wars, there were sort of relatively long intermissions of peace in between. Public infrastructure was weaponized, power plants were attacked, and the country during the civil war fragmented into different controlled areas where people would turn off the power for a competing faction, etc. So in this setting where infrastructure breaks down, the story with the generators begins as a backup solution. And they emerged to fill state electricity gaps, and by doing so, became kind of powerful political and economic actors in themselves. So selling this kind of backup electricity was actually quite profitable. And they developed kind of micro monopolies, particularly in urban areas where one generator would be affiliated with whichever political, sectarian, social group was most powerful in one area, and he would have the right to sell electricity and make sure that nobody else does that in his little territory. The story of this was that EDL blackouts were between 2 and 10 hours per day, depending on region. EDL was hugely inefficient, 40% network losses, that is in a leaky network, as well as a lot of theft, unpaid bills. And so about $2 billion of debt per year, coming up to 40 billion in total, which was a huge part of the aforementioned financial crisis that sort of exploded in 2019. And on the other hand, as I already described, these generators become sort of more and more economically and politically established. They're sometimes referred to as a generator mafia. This is not always entirely correct. You could say some of them are, they themselves do not portray themselves as such, but it's sort of the urban lingo to refer to them. And so here's a brief conceptual intervention. So it's a, sort of, in that sense, a very interesting case, an argument for the idea of technopolitics, that technology, politics, and culture sort of co-constitute each other. And in Lebanese vernacular, if you are at someone's place, you would frequently ask, what kind of electricity are we on? Because it depends what kind of devices you can plug in. Are we on dawle, which literally means state, or are we on ishtirak, which is the subscription to the generator? So sort of in everyday language, there's several words for electricity because this plays such a big role in structuring life. While these two systems have different economics and to some extent also different technologies behind them, they both rely on diesel. And that's the fuel that was suddenly very scarce in the summer and fall of 2021. Here you can see cars sort of jamming up in an effort to go to a petrol station. This is the highway, this is Tripoli, just south of Tripoli. I didn't take the picture. The reason fuel was short was not because there was no more available on the world market, but historically in Lebanon, as in many other places in that region, diesel was heavily subsidized. And so the state had to pay an extra for each gallon or diesel of fuel being sold at the petrol station. And since there was a huge financial crisis, it became more and more burdensome and difficult for the central bank to pay the difference between the price on the world market and the fixed price at the pump. Users anticipated that soon diesel would have to become more expensive. Another dynamic that is taking place here in course of this financial crisis is huge currency devaluation. So a liter or gallon of diesel became infinitely cheap during that time in dollar terms. So if you have access to fresh or dollars from abroad, a gallon would cost you, 3-4 cents in dollar terms. If you were still living in a regime of the local currency, it would still be the same price. And so this led to hoarding as well as to smuggling into neighboring Syria, where sort of wartime economy meant the prices were fluctuating. So the point, to return to our blackout, is that these fuel shortages affected the state utility, EDL, and the generators in equal measure. And solar PV became the only means to secure electricity access. You've seen this image and graph before, so that's what led up to this situation. Now, a step back sort of into the dissertation. You have now heard in a very abbreviated version the introduction and this historical chapter. I will tell you a bit more about the political economy of the energy market, about the businesses that were installing these systems. I will tell you a bit more about the households that suddenly lived, what I sort of in the dissertation term, under the patronage of the sun, that suddenly became energy autonomous and lived off-grid. I'll skip chapter 5, which is about microgrids, and then I'll tell you about my argument for the sort of rise of a circadian economy, where life is sort of more and more structured around sunshine in a way it was a few sort of 150 years ago. So in my third chapter, that has the sort of slightly provocative title, From Switzerland to Swaziland, the Political Economy of Lebanon's Renewable Energy Rush, I introduce the pioneering entrepreneurs who could sort of pick up the slack. Before, solar energy was a niche kind of market. Some UN agencies and NGOs would solarize a couple of schools here and there, and some green energy enthusiasts would do that, but it was a pretty rare occurrence. And suddenly they had their doors run in. They had to do night shifts. People would tell me, I have my engineers sleeping on the roof of the company because we just worked nonstop to keep up with all the demand. An important reason they could do so in these very difficult circumstances is that many of these companies were already working overseas. Even though they were small companies, they had quite a lot of experience of working in sub-Saharan Africa, installing systems there. And for those of you who sort of work in that part of the world, or any part of the world, you probably know Lebanese construction firms and Lebanese engineers sort of all over. So there I make this case that it was these transnational connections and diasporic connections that allowed these businessmen to hit the ground running so quickly. That was a key aspect that allowed for the transition to happen so quickly. That was sort of the first year of this market. In the second year, as we're in a context of a severe financial crisis, basically everybody starts trying to sell solar system. And sort of a kind of complaint was that anybody who knows how to climb a roof is now in the business of selling this stuff, because nothing else sells, but this everybody wants. Everybody's clawing together money to secure their electricity access. And the title of this chapter, and I've been sort of criticized by one of my readers for it, is that in policy circles, both within the international aid community, but also within government, people were primarily concerned with the low quality of this second wave of solar installations. And the sort of, in a very Lebanese narrative, the concern was that the country would sort of come off track from returning to be a wealthy, sort of well-organized Switzerland of the Middle East and become a more sort of underdeveloped African-esque place. And so the quote is from one of the sort of established engineers who was like, sort of, I'm so worried about this, we're going to lose revenues, but also a kind of quality of market and style of a political economy. All right. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4 then turns towards the actual people that use these systems. It's titled Each House a Nation, Life Under the Patronage of the Sun. And you kind of know this perspective again. We're in the Bekaa Valley. we're seeing the Lebanese mountain range, and an interlocutor of mine who shows me the panels on his roof just north of Baalbek. And this guy was, and it's sort of a sort of common moniker in a way, that people tell me, you know what, in this place, the state doesn't work, nothing works, we have to do everything ourselves. Everybody has to become a state itself. Everybody sort of became the state. I'm organizing my own water, I'm organizing my own electricity, and basically I'm organizing my own security always anyways. And so that sort of gave me, that's where the title comes from. And what kind of state you live in then really depends on how much money you have, right? If you're affluent, like this guy, this is in the hills above Zachle, if you know the geography, you have many panels, 60 plus, 20, 30 kilowatt hours peak. You have an EV. You don't even have to go to the stupid petrol station anymore where there's a huge queue and it's chaos. And you feel fantastic about yourself because you're also sort of getting to lay claim on kind of environmental virtue. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're a Syrian refugee sitting in an encampment and sort of the size of solar collection you have is about the size of a palm, that lights your meager little lamp under which you hope that your kids will be able to read in the evening, solar off-grid energy independence is less of a sort of joyful experience. So one of my findings or arguments, and it's kind of obvious, is that this form of off-grid life exacerbates energy inequalities or inequalities in general, right? Beyond that point, that they exacerbate existing inequality aspects, all these systems mediate social relationships. That means that people change their behavior. Going off-grid emancipates from this old dual energy regime, right? You don't have to worry as much about the useless state that never comes anymore. And you don't have to worry about the generator who comes with his big guys and collects his money, and you're a little bit afraid of him. But it also reconnects you to other things and people. Most importantly, since we're in a context of a severe financial crisis, you need, even if it's now relatively cheap, you still need money to buy that stuff. And so the two main avenues people could afford solar home systems was, on the one hand, through family abroad, right? And this is also a classical story in Lebanon, but also all over the world, where if local services don't function, right, diaspora overseas compensates, paying for education, healthcare, and now also in-house energy infrastructure. The other aspect is a strengthening of local political, religious, social networks of patronage. So in the context of Lebanon, depending on your political or religious identity, you might, even if you don't want to, you might find yourself going to whoever is in charge of your community. And also because it was in the news so much, so the biggest, in a way, solar program was by Abdel Hassan, Hezbollah's microfinance organization, and they installed thousands and thousands of systems. And so people I would interview, they said, you know what, I don't care for them, but that's the way I get to install solar power at home. A second interesting point is that solar home systems also lead to a kind of domestication of energy-related tensions, right? In the past, power goes out and you'd say, you know, the bloody state is not coming, the useless generator is also, you know, not doing a good job once again. But now, if you're sort of middle class, it's your kid who was playing on his PlayStation late at night and the battery is empty. And you can't have, you can't use, can't charge your phone in the morning. Yeah. And many of the people I interviewed would also describe, there's also a gender dynamic here, right? Where certain energy intensive tasks, ironing, washing, etc., would have to be relocated to different times. So I would have people tell me that now on a rainy day, we never ever wash, only on sunny days, because that's when there's ample electricity. All right, so much for the homes. Moving on to sort of a chapter that is about Bigger systems, how are we on time? Half an hour, I'll try to speed up. The rise of a circadian economy, new geographies of solar power. If, as I think you all should, you play around with Google Earth every now and then to see what the world looks like, you will not only see small systems, but you will see very big ones, like many, many hundreds of square meters, if you look at roofs in Lebanon. And these are solar systems on the tops of factories. For factories too, diesel became expensive, there was no electricity, and this is the cheapest way to power your machines. So people started plastering solar panels on their factory roofs. My main vignette or story here is that of Dahar Foods. Maybe some of you even know Master Chips. It's kind of a global brand who claimed, at least at the time, I'm not sure if it's still the case now, to have the largest PV system in the country, I think 2.2, 2.5 megawatts. And so they replaced or stopped using a huge generator, you could almost say power plant, with this system. The important point I want to highlight that's really interesting is that they said because of this, we also stopped doing night shifts, because night shifts are so expensive now. Labor is still very cheap, but just energy costs are so disproportionately high at night that we only work during the day. So my argument here is that solarizations not only reconfigures everyday life, but also industrial and economic life. It also, that's the second half of this chapter, reconfigures geography. And that's the case because solar panels need a lot of space. And so in a densely populated urban environment, it's very tricky to equip each household in a 10-story house with solar systems, because you just don't have enough square footage on the roof. In the countryside, on the other hand, that's kind of an easy affair. Solar country, diesel city is what I wrote here at the bottom. And it leads to new spatial and, as I mentioned before, also sort of temporal patterns in life. All right. Well, the conclusion came quicker than I expected. I thought there was fiction in between. And if we sort of, if I think about this book, maybe the weakest chapter is my conclusion. I return to the state and this question whether the Lebanese example just suggests that electricity as an avenue of state power and governance is waning in light of these new technological affordances. The second point I make, and maybe we can discuss this a little bit here too, is that such, in a way, maybe even somehow romantic decentralization and localization of energy and autonomy actually relies on huge global networks, right? So even though you now have in-house power and you sort of off the grid, you still needed money, often coming from relatives that live across the globe. You were still relying on very affordable products from Chinese production, right? Like that's like a key argument. None of this would have happened were it not so cheap these days to buy this stuff, and that you have these supply chains that work quite well. And the sort of third global connection I mentioned here is this patronage of the sun argument, that you obviously are suddenly bound to the comings and goings of sunlight, that unlike the comings and goings of state or generator, electricity is quite predictable. But on the other hand, you can't, it's not malleable. You can't say, I bribe myself into getting preferential access in terms of sunlight. And the final point, and maybe also sort of that can segue into a conversation or discussion here, is that I try to frame the Lebanese experience and the Lebanese changing energy landscape as sort of as an example of experimentations with energy transition. And that as a set of dynamics that are very extreme there, but nonetheless play out in other parts of the world too, right? Fossil fuel supply shocks are something we're quite familiar with in Europe since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine too, where suddenly everybody was very worried we'd have a blackout because of gas shortages or gas stop from Russia. We have had major blackouts in Spain very recently. The United States is also has a sort of maybe more experience in terms of weak incumbent infrastructure than would be ideal. So that is kind of the comparative argument or lens, where I hope this is also kind of an interesting story beyond the very small country of Lebanon on the Western Mediterranean. I'm done here. Thank you very much for bearing with me. Yeah, and that's it. And also in between, yeah, a question, please, and take drinks, etc. Right? And I will take a drink because I talk so much. Yeah, Jenny.
You just mentioned at the end that what did you say about people having access to the sun? Like nothing's gonna forget exactly what you said, but nothing, anyone can access the sun.
Yeah, I mean, the sun comes and goes in its own rhythm, right?
Right. But I think, in your dissertation, you had a lot of examples of how, access is actually incredibly differential, right? Like even just like who's allowed to put solar panels on their roof, right? Who has space, and you had all these examples of people sort of like demanding the destruction of their neighbor's solar panels if they were blocking theirs, right? So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So that's the point I sort of only mentioned super briefly here. In the cities, rooftops used to be places for sort of marginalized places, for people who have weakness for pigeons and hanging up laundry, and the very poor type of thing, and maybe a dog or something, or a chicken. And suddenly, the rooftop became super, super interesting, right? And the people who were quick to figure out that this is actually quite doable just installed, relatively large systems on the top of their apartment building, put the cables through on the other side of the building, connected to the batteries in their washing room. And then a few weeks later, somebody else would come onto the roof having the same idea and realize, oh, there's 4 systems on the roof. The whole roof has been taken off. But you still had 20 other parties in the house who also want to do this. And so legally, in Lebanon, as well as many other places, the exterior of the building belongs to everyone. So technically, you would need a signature from every apartment owner that says, yes, Camillo has the right to install this on this part of the roof. And what ensued were sort of big fights over rooftops. In some instances, a big landlord would say, take it away again. And I also mentioned this, very briefly mentioned the topic of regulation. The state, right, without any money in its pockets, in a way, I'm not sure what the right term is, but sort of incapable of doing any real infrastructural action, became constrained to regulation. And so the people in the Ministry of Energy had a great idea, and they were like, what we're going to do, we're going to start forcing people to license their rooftop solar systems, and we're going to check it on safety of the installation and if everything is welded correctly, and there'll be a little fee that obviously, and it has to be the company that installs it, it has to be certified with the order of engineers, and then you have to send your letter of application, etc. So they sort of made themselves, or tried to make themselves, quite busy by somehow playing a part in this, because there is a unit in charge of energy transition, and they were completely blindsided when everybody just started doing what they had been asking people to do for the last 10 years without their help. So much for the sort of the urban tensions. And then I would say, the main component is still, are you rich, are you poor? And there, if I was more into sort of quantitative analysis of how people are doing, the solar panel square footage is a wonderful indicator in a place like Lebanon at the moment for socioeconomic status, right? You ask them, how many square meters do you have of this stuff? And then you will know many other things about, you don't even have to ask them, you can just go on Google Maps and and look at it. Yeah. Mike, and then me.
First of all, it's great, and I really like the discussion of the household dynamic.
Yeah.
It's wonderful, which is why I want to push on it a little and ask the questions kind of like outside of it. So
Yeah.
if every household is becoming a state,
Yeah.
what does commerce look like in a place like this? Like, what do people make? How do people access electricity in order to actually make a living outside of the house? Because it seems that the state would be implicated in that to some extent. And
Yeah.
or like, what do people do? How do they labor? What do they make? And what electricity needs does it have?
Yeah. So we've in the household, it's sort of more, it's like a domain that, because of the affordances of cheap panels and relatively well-working batteries, has been kind of taken from what used to be a public service, right? It's no longer as necessary to be a public service. If we speak about the productive economy, which is kind of a small part of the Lebanese economy, but if we think about hotels or these chips manufacturers, those who are successful at the moment, to my understanding, are the ones who are able to make a maximum amount of power on their own roofs, right? So Coca-Cola Lebanon has a massive solar system on their roof. And all sort of any kind of serious business would have been able to operate off the grid even before this crisis, right? Electricity comes in different qualities. And if you have fluctuations of voltage and frequency, it's bad for expensive machinery. So sort of the big guys used to have their own systems already. What they do now is sort of hybridize those and say, during the day, I can turn off 9 of my 10 gensets, of my 10 generators, and only use, 50 gallons of diesel an hour, whereas I used to burn 5,000. I made these numbers up, but it's in this ratio. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Camillo. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I was surprised to see that every household is using solar panel,
Yeah.
and there was a rapid transition. So my question is, what are the unique enabling conditions for Lebanon to make this transition happen? Because blackout and energy issue is not a problem for only for the Lebanon, but like a lot of different countries. And what are the lessons like you can bring out like from your experiences for other countries to
Yeah.
make more sustainable and more equitable?
So I think one thing we could expect to see in the future is just that as this technology becomes more and more available, this kind of response to an energy crisis becomes more feasible and likely, one thing. The other thing that I mentioned before is sort of what you could call the diasporic nature of Lebanon's political economy. That is that many people have relatives abroad that can pay for stuff. Even if you're out of a job at home suddenly, you have somebody who can say, you know what? So I will give you $5,000 for this bloody solar system, so you stop bugging me about your electricity needs. And that is something that is a bit specific to this country, right? Where you have about 4 to 5 billion people living inside the territory. And these numbers are not super clear, but sort of assume 20 million outside. So that is really sort of an extreme case of this. And the third thing, yeah, were these entrepreneurs, I would say, who also had a very specific tool set to start working very quickly. And last thing I would tell you is that similar phenomena are happening in other places, to my understanding, right? So in one other early case is Yemen, where there's been like absolutely no electricity for quite a long time. And many people have smaller than in Lebanon, but still solar panels. Another example recently is Nigeria, where fuel subsidies have also been cut and people are just can't afford this kind of backup anymore. Pakistan, to my understanding too, where there's huge brownouts and load shedding, plus rising fuel costs, is also a place where this type of market is booming.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
If you can share a bit more about your data collection process,
Yeah.
like how did you like identify your sample and approach people, what type of people, especially like when you have a chance to talk with the diaspora that you're making to translate information, like how you like do that. And the second question would be like, it is still a relatively short amount of time, but like the unintended consequence, like all this like environmental waste that is now generated, if you know a bit more about it.
So in terms of organizing fieldwork and methods, I relied on a network of friends and contacts I had there before. And the businessmen, this is also in a way why this is the first ethnographic chapter, because the people who were working in this, they were very keen to talk about what they had recently achieved, right? They were proud to say, I'm working like a maniac, and I'm doing great business, and look at all the cool solar systems I'm building on hospitals and homes, etc. So there I was sort of snowballing in different groups of actors. And then you've worked in the aid sector, so once you have some connections there, I think you can, you will find somebody at UNDP who then talk sort of snowballing, maybe a bit chaotic. Does that respond to the first question?
But yes, but then what about the households? How did you
Yeah.
approach them? And like, as you mentioned, like the entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
the households,
Yeah.
did you
Yeah.
talk to the big companies? Like,
Yeah.
who are those you talk to?
So the households, I would just try to meet people, I tried to have a sample, at least have, sort of a couple of rich guys and a couple of not so wealthy people and some in the middle. That was kind of my goal there. And I would tell everybody I met, like, do you know somebody with a solar system? Can I interview your uncle? Can I interview your cousin, your aunt, etc.? So that is also, I would say, easy in a place like Lebanon, where ties and connections are easy and people are very happy to forward you. It's like, go meet this person, tell them I sent you. And the same for the company too. And obviously some people I didn't get in touch with. The state utility was a bit tricky at times. Once one was inside, it turned out being easy. The hardest were the IMF, for instance. That was very tricky.
What about the mafia?
The mafia, of course, and I'm guilty of calling them a mafia because, of course, they are no mafia, right? I have to defend them there. You would meet people who would say, my God, thank you that you talked to me, finally, right? All these idiots, they call me a mafia. I'm giving them electricity. If I don't give them, they come and they call me 600 times at 4 o'clock in the morning because my generator is off. So they too, in many instances, were keen to talk. They were particularly keen to talk in rural areas where they had gone out of business, right? So that's, I may not have emphasized this enough, that you have cities where the generators continue to be like these powerful micro monopolies, and you have a couple of big guys who own hundreds of generators. And in the countryside, where in a place like Baalbek, I forget the numbers, but there were like, I think, 40 people in this business. And when I left the country in 2023, there were like 2 guys who were still doing this. He said, I used to have 38 colleagues, they're all gone. And they made the strong point, like, so how much of a powerful mafia are we if we can't even survive such a little hit? And they, like many others, and my colleagues who do research on the political economy of fossil fuels in Lebanon would say, actually, the really powerful people are those that import oil. That's where the real money lies, with the big ships and the fuel trucking, and not the dirty small work and they're like a scapegoat. Okay. And the second question? Environmental waste. Environmental waste. It's a big concern. People don't yet know. I tended to be of the opinion, and opinionated as I am, that it's in comparison to the horror of PM and sort of what do you call it, air pollution from diesel generators. We can think about the stupid panels later. Lead acid batteries, they break very quickly. They're, if you do the right stuff, they're pretty easy to recycle. Lithium batteries, which are becoming a bigger and bigger share of the market, it's a bit of a problem still. So sure, it's a what is it? I think it's a big tackleable problem. So I see it. Not yet. So people are waiting for the wave, the waste wave.
Yeah, so I have a question about robberies.
Robberies.
If there's a kind of because it becomes like something that it is an indicator of
Yeah.
wealth in a way.
Yeah.
Do they
Yes.
also become a target?
Yeah.
Is there a kind of a black market of,
Yeah.
and about that is like the role of the state there,
Yeah.
like in terms of security.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I would say sort of like a cliched thing that I believe to be true in a place like Lebanon is that there is very little to almost no petty crime. Like it's a small and in a way hyper surveilled place. So if somebody were to take my wallet, which is possible, unlikely, but possible, it would have, sort of somebody at some point would have said, take his wallet, it's okay, you can take his wallet. But you would not have, also sort of out of the Civil War history, people are in a way also very careful, I feel. And so I was always considering that this was, sort of the country was going through what the World Bank described as one of the world's worst economic crises since the Great Depression. There was very little rise in sort of petty theft and crime. Another reason, it's a very small place. It's what, 400 kilometers long and 60 kilometers wide. And you've got the best fortified border in the south of Israel. You don't want to send panels there. And in Syria, people are even poorer. So it also is just a geography where a kind of trading across borders, selling stuff is tricky. That would be my not entirely thought through response to that.
My question, I want to know if you have ever observed any kind of, like now you're talking about a lot like household-based,
Yeah.
installation. Are there any kind of more radical form or like convenient form of like, transformation happening or attempts happening?
Community-wise?
Yeah, community-wise.
Yeah, so this is the chapter I didn't show you. It's chapter 5 on microgrids. So of course, in that sense, your question is great, right? Because how silly is it if each one of us builds our own solar system, the battery is full by 11 o'clock in the morning, then all this capacity on the roof goes to waste, right? Can't store it anywhere else. Your next door neighbor doesn't have any electricity. You can't share it with him. So the solution and sort of technopolitical vision for that is the microgrid, the village microgrid, right? We say, well, this makes so much sense. Let's leapfrog over the heavy state infrastructure and just say in a certain community we build that stuff. Turns out to be technically a little bit complicated and sociopolitically super complicated. For instance, that's where the generator story in a way would come in again. If you still have somebody who does this business of trading, of selling electricity in that neighborhood, and then you say, oh, I will also sell electricity to all your customers, he would likely say, no, thank you, no, thank you, you're not going to do that here. And these are larger investments. And the law in Lebanon, that's actually an important point, is still such that the state has a monopoly on all things electrical, right? EDL, this crumbling utility, is the only entity in the country that is legally allowed to sell electricity. Another reason for the generators to be called the mafia, because what they do is technically illegal, even though it's like common practice. So if you were an investor, right, you and I say, you know what, this is a great business opportunity and it's a good idea. Let's invest $5 million in a couple of microgrids there. We wouldn't find people to give us the money because if then the local police wants to come by and say, actually, we're confiscating it all, they could. The courts that work in strange ways, in slow ways, would tell them, yeah, you're right, this isn't. So I think illegality, as well as very specific geographic political context, prevent larger investments in communal infrastructures. There are some exemptions, but to prove the rule. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear more about the durability of energy transitions that occur in periods of crises with kind of in an ad hoc way, where there's maybe not much of a centralized and organized transition, and if maybe future prices of oil and the decline of prices, how that will affect how the transition unfolds, and maybe if we're seeing, as you're saying, more of a hybridization of the energy supply that allows for expanded demand rather than like a transition.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's sort of I remember a fight I had with a very elusive IMF guy, right, who was very nice, and he said, "Listen, people like you love the shit. You think it's romantic that people here have their solar panels and then you want villages to electric. But that's not the future. The future is cheap, massive, large amounts of electricity. And for that, we need a different kind of grid and a different type of system. And so the main thing is that that stuff has to be cheap. And yes, it has to be carbon neutral as well. So there's a kind of, there are competing visions there, right? It's like I would say very similar to the debates that happen in agriculture and nutrition, right? Where you're like, you know, is it a silly romantic idea to say that I should make my own potatoes? Probably. Is there an argument for local supply chains too? Yes. Do some people think it's very unwise? Also yes. So that's a debate between centralization and decentralization that is ongoing, and probably that, you know, the future is open. Yeah. We're close to time. Should I look at this? Here, did people write something? Yes.
I mean, just following on from that, can you talk a little bit, and I know we've talked about this, but why EDL cannot transition in a way to, you know, in the way that households are transitioning,
Yeah.
right? I mean, why couldn't EDL solarize? Why
Yeah.
couldn't they imagine a different
Yeah.
future, even if it's large scale?
Yeah. So EDL, the state utility, right? They have a bunch of very decrepit power plants that sit on the coast. The newest one was built, I think, in 1992 and should be decommissioned according to the companies that constructed it. And from an outsider's perspective, and there have been offers by companies like Siemens who said, just give us the whole thing. Give us the whole thing and we'll fix it, right? Put a bunch of solar farms over there and do it. But it's politically complicated in the very complicated situation of the Lebanese state, where it's a public utility that can only move very slow because it's bound by the rules of Lebanese politics, which I've in a way failed to tell you much about, and I won't in the last few minutes. So there's sort of one aspect is this, and the other aspect is that solarizing or increasing the portion of renewable energy in an existing grid is very hard. And the sort of the good example, and I think it's now there's some consensus, a few days ago, we've had a massive blackout in Portugal and Spain. And what seems to be the cause of this massive blackout is the high portion of renewables on that grid, right? So if you have a centralized grid and 60% of all power comes from solar farms, right? And you have a storm system, a brewing, and suddenly it's shady, you need to find a replacement for 60% of all the power in your grid. And so that can be in modern grids, if they're interconnected, like in Austria, we buy electricity from Norway because the dams there are still working. Or you have fancy gas turbines that you can switch on, and they already know, this computer already knows the cloud is coming, it's covering the solar panels, and we have sort of fossil backup ramping up immediately in order for supply to meet demand. Maybe that's another electricity 101 that I didn't mention. In an electrical grid, demand and supply must always be equal, right? It's like a water system. You can't have like more electricity pushed into the system than is being consumed. So the work of a grid manager is to make sure that you produce exactly the amount of electricity that everybody on your system is consuming. If you have intermittent renewables, wind or solar, that suddenly come online, it's a trickier vehicle to operate. And if you look at this building, right, they don't have a control room. It's basically 1965 is the kind of technology they're operating on now. Even if you gave them a state-of-the-art, whatever, 200 megawatts facility in the Sahel in northern Bekaa Valley, you couldn't just plug that in. You need a pretty fancy grid to absorb renewables. Yeah. Any other questions? I think we're out of time also. If you stick around, you can ask me more questions or tell me your true dark opinion. Thank you so much for coming.
wine beer over here, water and.
Thank you. Thanks. Good to see you. I think I saw you on the bike, at least from some angle.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, you have to run. Yeah. I'm going to the game here. Yeah. Thank you. You're here for the weekend, right? Yeah, awesome. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. It means a lot. Yeah, see ya. Yeah, thank you.
Great, I love that. Thank you.
Does it work? Oh, there you go. Yeah. Everything.
How is your system?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
That kind of talk.
Yeah.